This recording is going to be a sort of look through and read through of the RPG Oceania 2084, which is the winner of the, I believe, 45th My RPG Book Club. As you can see, this is the free text-only edition, and I'm mostly going to be looking through this as I normally would, maybe jumping around just a bit more to sort of make sure things are comprehensive and I get a look at some of the further on parts of the book, which might be a little less polished than some of the earlier portions. I'm going to be providing some of my thoughts as well to sort of provide feedback to the creator and give anyone else watching a chance to see whether the book is something they would like to check out. Right off the bat, I think the title page is pretty effective for what it is. Maybe a little austere, but it is the austere edition, so that fits. You know, the eye, this is sort of an Orwellian system where it's a bunch of players against some sort of big brother or government, or in some cases I think even each other. And so the eye overlooking makes sense. Not sure what all the little dots are supposed to signify, but it's a little more visually interesting than it would be without them, at least. Moving on, that's, just the logo of the designer or their company, and they've submitted a few things to my RPG, so it's definitely nice to see them keep making projects and progress with all of them. A lot of credits. Nice to see so many people mentioned in the acknowledgements and the playtesters mentioned too. That's always nice. Now this is my first time looking through most of this, but I have looked at some of it before, and I'm not sure I like this overview fully. Like, I wouldn't really call it an overview, more like kind of statistics of the system, even though that's not quite the right word. Like, you get some of the basic stuff that it's a tabletop role-playing game, though they use the term pen and paper role-playing game, which is maybe not the best idea. Unless I read through this and find that pen and paper are necessary, but you can do a lot of VTT, virtual tabletop stuff now, and it's still a tabletop game, but technically no longer a pen and paper game, so it's a little bit more of a specific descriptor than it needs to be. Like, we've got some of the themes, but it doesn't feel like there's really an overview of the mechanics or the kind of game it is, which I think is a bit more necessary than the themes are. And like, you can get away with just one theme for this kind of thing, like just social dystopia, and that probably tells me what I need to know in an overview for the theme, but there's nothing on the resolution mechanic or the kind of role-playing game it is really, unless you can sort of divine it from this stuff, which some of it might be helpful, like PBTA, roguelikes, though I don't really know what that means in a tabletop sense, but other things are a little less helpful there. Now, this I think is very cool, the code for the Spotify playlist. I haven't looked at that. I don't really use Spotify very often, but I think it's neat to see. I haven't seen it that often, that sort of thing. Yeah, CC, I'm guessing Creative Commons, though I'm not that far into licensing stuff, but that's always nice to see. Now, also thinking about the table of contents, I don't really love what I've seen so far of that. Like, for a tabletop book, the table of contents is really important to sort of, be able to navigate the text and learn at your own pace and use it as a reference book and all of those things. And for that, it's really good to know where everything is in each section. And stuff like, the world is wrong, I can guess that that's sort of a overview of the tone of the game, and having one thing like that isn't terrible. But there's a bunch of stuff there that really is not self-explanatory. I guess core principles kind of works, but it's a little weird that that's after these two other things already. You'd think some of the core principles would be in there, unless they mean mechanics, and that's not really something I would instantly link to core principles. Like, I don't know what of any of this introduction refers to what the game is like mechanically, and that's something I'm really interested in that point. Even getting on to here, I still don't really know, like, Big Brother preparations. But at this point, I have no clue what Big Brother is in the context of the game, so that's also not really helpful as a descriptor. Character creation is the first thing I can really see on here and be like, oh, okay, I know what that is, without already having knowledge of the system. Like, from then on, it's probably fine. Playing the game. Page 22 is maybe a little late for that, but I know what that's probably going to be at least. Like, GM advice, variations to the game, but still not where the game itself is, really. Just more modifiers to it. Like, more sort of GM advice, sort of examples of play, I'm guessing. These are for specific mechanics, I'd guess, so that is nice to see, but still not clear where in all this stuff the game is really explained. Shared rules, like, that is definitely something I don't understand just looking at the system without, prior context. I'm guessing maybe it's rules that refer to both the person playing as Big Brother and the normal players, and what applies to both of them, but that's just a guess. Acts and reactions, so sort of weird that that's not covered under playing the game, but I don't really know what they are yet, so I can't say. That might be fine, it might not. Yeah, and a lot of this stuff does seem to be like we're getting into more broad sweeping mechanics now, but it's also sort of questionable why that's not under playing the game. Up is resistance rules, and I'm guessing that's, why that's not under shared rules is that it only applies to the resistance or characters that are resisting or whatever it may be. And if that's the case, I'm not seeing a category for rules that apply directly to what is not the resistance. Though once again, that's just based off of my assumption about what, shared rules means. I haven't really been reading the table of contents out loud at all, because I figure people don't really want me to just list the table of contents, but once we get into further stuff, I'll probably actually be reading out some of it. And yeah, I did forget the table of contents for this one is multiple pages, which I don't necessarily love, but it may be justified depending on the situation. Classes, which I don't know if that's for characters at all. If it's just for characters, it's a little funny that it's so far after character creation. Like, it's not surprising to have class details be separate than general characterization description, but it is for it to be so far displaced from it. Yeah, so this is the Big Brother rules then, I'm guessing. 2 minutes of hate. Now that sounds exciting. Thought crime rules. Lots of tables. Campaign rules. post-game debrief. I wonder if that's per session or per campaign. I think that's a cool thing to have, at least. And setting info, which I do like being sort of at the end. Yeah, I also forgot to mention I like safety tools being relatively early on. That's always nice to have, though. I generally think tools can be kind of a narrow way to look at it, depending on the circumstances. Yeah, just looking at the way this table of contents designed, you've got 4 pages and like 8 listed headings for those 4 pages, and that really harms the readability of the table of contents and makes it 2 pages when, since it's all like that, it doesn't really need to be. So I would probably not be listing all of these headings, or maybe make a secondary, more detailed table of contents or something, just so there's something that gives you a bit more of an easy overview. Because looking at all of this, I feel like it doesn't give me much about the structure of the game or even of the book at present. Ah, there was more. I don't think I even scrolled this far before. That's... yeah, 3 pages for a table of contents, probably excessive. Because this book is only 103, which is not bad for a free project at all in terms of length, but for a 3-page table of contents, that's probably a mismatch. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And that is from 1949. Are you saying that was when he made the quote? Because I just got my wires crossed there. I thought, I don't know really much about George Orwell's book, so I don't know if he's also written a book called 1945. Like, this is probably more proper citation, but my head, especially knowing he's written 1984, immediately goes to there being a book called 1949, which is probably on me, but still. I screamed at the figure of hate like everyone else, but it was wrong. It took me a long time to realize this. Everything is wrong. We are alone. They hear. Everyone, anyone, is your enemy. We are afraid to think, and I am so alone. I could apply for a husband, but why would I want someone to go through the facade with? I wish I could remember the world that was used. I wish I could remember the word, I thought that said the world, that was used to mean a feeling between people, if there was one. I'm fighting back. I've found a place where I can't be seen. If you're reading this, you feel it too. Now, I would have assumed that was a quote, but it doesn't look like it. And, in light of me not being sure it is a quote, if it was a direct quote from 1984, I wouldn't really bother critiquing it, because, that's the tone it's going for, but assuming this is a piece of writing by the author, just based on guesswork, because I really don't know that much about 1984, the tone they're going for, but it seems a little too much almost, in the sense of this person not even knowing if there was a word for a feeling between people, or if there was one. Like, that is very, very extreme. Like, poetically, the feeling it gives is right. If you take it a little more literally, that might be too much for the setting. I don't know yet, because I don't know much about the setting. The world is wrong. Imagine a world where the media conglomerates dictate who is good and who is bad. The only emotional outburst permissible is the nightly hate on the bad people. The status quo is policed by might and fear, where you dress, work, look, socialize, and do what you're told when you're told. So, where you dress, work, look, socialize, and do what you're told, I think that sentence doesn't really... yeah, it kind of makes sense. It's like the dress, work, look, socialize, and do are all modified by what you're told, but grammatically that doesn't fit for all of them, because you don't dress what you're told, and I don't know. Yeah, as you're told would probably read slightly better. Any attempt to diverge, invite violence into your life. Invites, it should be there. State attention, people informing on you, then, one night, they whisk you away. This is the world you enter. This is where you make connections and fight a tiny rebellion. You know that this is futile. Going down this path will end unpleasantly, but you have nothing to lose, and that gives you something you've not felt in a while, hope. So this does give me a lot on the tone of the game, and it also tells me that any player character is supposed to at least start out as someone who is rebellious of the society, if not the Big Brother itself, or just generally the way things are. We'll see if that remains consistent throughout other parts of the book. And we've gotten, let's see, about half another page, so about 2.5 pages just dedicated to sort of tone and writing of the more artistic variety, but not a lot on what the game is itself so far. Introduction. You hold in your hands, I don't, but, I could, Oceania 2084, the surplus edition. It's the austere edition, I think, so technically no. The existence of this printed book would have been impossible if not for all those who backed the project, so thank you. I can't personally thank them, because they didn't do anything for me, but, it's kind of, I can give a general thank you for people contributing to projects like this, because, maybe I wouldn't even be able to access the digital version otherwise. These last years have been a personal journey for me. Alright, so, I very much appreciate this. It's very nice to, offer these sort of sentiments. This is still not the introduction. Look, if I, is not what I would consider an introduction to a tabletop game. It's more of an acknowledgments, really. And it's a very long time to wait before getting into the actual introduction to the game. Starting with the idea to write a game that held very personal meaning to me, and ending with creating something that I feel proud of, and I generally hope will give memorable experiences. Certainly, I hope that as well. I feel a lot of support from the community that is formed around this game. Thank you all. Oceania 2084 is a tabletop role-playing game. This is more the introduction, set in a world based on the dystopia as imagined by George Orwell in the book 1984. I wonder how directly it's based on it, whether it's more inspired by or actively trying to recreate it. At its core, Oceania 2084 is about rebellion despite unimaginably, that's a lot different than imaginary, unimaginably bad odds. It is about organizing against totalitarian governments. At this point, I wonder if I should even bother trying to read this out. You can probably do a better job yourself. It is about love and humanity despite overwhelming oppression. So definitely getting the impression that player characters are supposed to be rebellious, definitively. Orwell's version of the party and Big Brother. In the book 1984, the party is formed around a political ideology that Orwell names Ingsoc, English socialism. It was a warning against authoritarian socialism, Stalinism, and the oppressive Soviet regime, and simultaneously a comment on ideologies that have nothing to do with socialism, claiming the name for themselves, such as Hitler's National Socialists. Orwell in no way diminished the horrors of right-wing authoritarianism. The position is wholeheartedly anti-authoritarian, showing the reader that, I don't really like the way that's cut off, that's kind of annoying, but sometimes there's not much you can do about these things. You could probably at least decrease the size of this footnote. Like, I read the designer's note not out loud. I feel like it's a little much, just in terms of you probably don't need to specify that it provides no real solutions to genocide. No one really expects that. Certainly not tactics. That would almost be concerning if it did. And I do believe that it will inspire many to recontextualize their own lives, see the world through new perspectives, and spark important conversations. And I really do like the sentiment behind that, but in the context of talking about real world genocides, it does come off as a little bit conceited to me, because just in terms of how far of a reach the game will have to even reach people that are currently being affected by genocides, and that it would have a significant impact on them recontextualizing their lives in the context of that. It might be just a little bit much. Authoritarianism is oppressive no matter what origin ideas it sprung out of. I'm gonna just skip to the phone now because I'm curious. Basically just saying that 1984 is not necessarily a criticism of the ideas of socialism itself, just authoritarianism in general, whether socialist or not, I think is the intent there. This is the basis for establishing the politics of the conglomerate in the year 2084. The conglomerate is what I use instead of the party. Taking Orwell's imagined dystopia and updating it to our current political landscapes, I refer to the politics of the conglomerate as post-lib dem, indicating that it is about what happens when corporate liberal democracies take a fascist turn. This is sort of, where we're thinking about whether it is inspired by or based on 1984. And given that they are taking, a completely different direction for the source of the authoritarianism, and not just by making it more general so you can plug in whatever you want, but going in a specific different direction, that is more in the territory of inspired rather than based on. In Oceania 2084, the players define the political ideas of the conglomerate. Well, that kind of sounds like you can take it any direction, rather than necessarily being post-lib dem, but we'll see when we get there. In Oceania 2084, the players define the political ideas of the conglomerate when they create their characters and their world. This allows your gaming group to explore different variations of authoritarian oppression. Yep, and just to quickly cover, part of the reason why I'm reading a lot of this out loud is, sort of just so I have to do the less editing, because there would be a lot of blank pauses, a lot more blank pauses if I was just reading silently, but also because I know reading this kind of book where it's all sort of just, it's a lot of text and it is not made necessarily very reader-friendly for people. I figured I could sort of try to help with that, so you don't have to invest a lot of time into trying to read something that's difficult for you without knowing it's to your taste. So hopefully this recording gives you a bit more of an impression on whether you'll like the game before you have to invest the time and potentially effort of reading it. If I was really going full accessibility, I'd also caption this video, but I probably do not have the time to do that. Some things will be the same in all play sessions. There are no clear laws. There is no crime but thought crime. Thought crime is the name given to any act or impulse that is disloyal to the conglomerate. A misplaced laugh, crying when someone who was a traitor was vaporized, or simply not following orders might make you suspicious in the eyes of the conglomerate. Your level of freedom is defined by how trusted you are. Higher levels of trust grant bigger freedoms. The closer to the conglomerate you are, the more they keep an eye on you. So with higher freedom of movement and actions, the more your movement and actions, the more your actions and movements are under scrutiny. Yeah, so the freer you are, the more trusted you are, the freer you are, and the closer to the conglomerate you are, the more they keep an eye on you. So, the more trusted in this case and closer you are to them is, the same thing. It was probably obvious, but it's not a physical closeness, it's not even a closeness in terms of political power necessarily, it's just a closeness in terms of how much they trust you, but they also watch you more the more they trust you and the more free you are, I guess. That seems like it might be a little bit of a mismatch. Okay. The tools of oppression are the same, but the reasons change and develop. That says in other words, but it doesn't really apply to most of that, but that's kind of just a minor complaint. Core principles. True liberation of the world is not possible. Is that like a setting thing, or just sort of a general philosophy the players are supposed to have? Okay, you play. Okay, so that's definitely that's not going to happen in the course of the game, it looks like, based on you play to explore, not to win. We are what we leave behind. I do not know what that means. Friendship and true connection challenge power and make resistance possible. That really does not seem to fit with any other aspect of the tone that I've seen so far, so we'll have to see how that develops and whether that's really supported. To portray dystopia, we do not have to describe every gory detail. I feel like this is too many core principles. Like, this is sort of advice on how to roleplay or how to describe things. And then you have stuff like, we are what we leave behind. It doesn't really seem like there's a general theme to what kind of core principles these are. Because I would say this and this are very different categories of thing, and it kind of feels like this is just what the creators what popped into their head when they were writing this, and not necessarily something they've thought over and tried to define each aspect of the most important things. Okay, physical conflict is rare, a rare and brutal occurrence. Violence is common. That needs more explaining, because, violence typically does require physical conflict, depending on how you define that. And Big Brother sees you. Oh, okay, they are explained further, that's nice. I'm not going to read through all of these, I think. Okay? All is lost besides the character's individuality and their spirit. Honestly, it seems like for this sort of dystopia, it should be the reverse. Like, a lot of their physical needs will be taken care of. The world does not seem to be inherently doomed in terms of some sort of crisis that will just start killing people, or environmental destruction or anything like that. The only thing that seems to be specifically lost is their individuality and spirit, and that can be regained, and that's sort of the point of the game, but That sort of seems to be the main thing that is lost. Okay, this is kind of complicated because it's saying that, you know, your character's deaths will not be noticed in any way, but that it is important to leave a trace, which is sort of contradictory. And I get it's like, you know, things as they are versus as you're trying to make them to an extent, but it does come off as kind of just contradictory. When there is no possibility to organize, all we have is each other. Again, sort of contradictory because having each other, I would assume, is some form of organization. Like, not a literal organization, but, you know, organization as the verb. They are organizing together, just in a limited capacity. Okay, survival rely on each other. Our survival is based on the trust, love, and care of our comrades. I don't know about that. That seems very positive. And that might be fine, but that's sort of like, I feel like that's not going to be easy to establish in a session based on the mechanics, but I don't even know what those mechanics are. I just, from what else I've read about the system, it does not seem to be one where, you know, sort of, I hate to say it like this because it's not really what I mean, but sort of lovey-dovey stuff does not seem like it's inherently encouraged by the system from other stuff I've seen. Okay. So, like, to sort of go into more detail about how I don't think the, you know, friendship message is really consistent, is that this description is really not different from your standard tabletop game. Right? Normally, the antagonists are stronger than the protagonists. There's a big bad that you're slowly going to start defeating across the entire course of the game, and the way your party comes together and, you know, through love and trust and stuff is how success normally occurs. So this is sort of acting like it's a particularly unusual thing, but in most RPGs, NPCs are not going to do much. The bad guys are stronger than the good guys. And your survival is based on the trust, love, and care of your comrades against this overwhelming force. Like, that is all the same across even your basic Dungeons and Dragons game, pretty much. And this is supposed to be a particularly sort of oppressive Orwellian adventure, so I feel like some of the descriptions here are a bit off. It's a little too positive, even though I think from this is intended to be negative, but if you think about it, you know, violence is common, especially, that's just typical tabletop. Like, I'm not trying to, it's hard to explain exactly what my complaint is. I guess if I had to summarize it, it's just, this contextualizes this sort of trust, love, and care of comrades, really contextualize all of this into just being a normal tabletop game, because of just being a, you know, stable and reliable party allows you to resist all of this. Then all of this does not seem different from, say, an evil dragon lord or in a bunch of scattered villages or something like that. Nothing about this is dystopian if love, trust, and care come so readily and is effective. Like, the reason why a typical tabletop game is not dystopian, even though there is common violence and oppressive, enemies, is the focus on love, care, and how that helps you survive and stuff like that. In most dystopian settings, you would expect, there to be distrust between players. And that does not seem to be encouraged so far. Okay, safety tools. Alright, I've taken a bit of a break, fixed my microphone a little, and I read ahead a bunch, and I can definitely say there are some problems that I think the system has, or maybe not really with the system, but this sort of bills itself as a group storytelling game, and I don't know that I would fully define it as such, because all of the group elements where other players can jump in when one player is describing a scene aren't really collaborative or building a story together. They're just having a bunch of different players do the actions that would normally be required by a GM. Like, saying a specific player who is doing an act has to make a check. It's not called a check because it just doesn't determine success or failure in most cases. It just grants the Big Brother player a chance to levy a certain consequence, which that part of the system is relatively complex, so I couldn't even remember what it is at this point. It is either adding stress or using a free sort of interference action that the the Big Brother would normally have to spend points to act but can be enacted immediately, or that is what stress gives them a chance to do, which is the thing that's added, and I can't quite remember which. And then the other thing that, another player can jump in and do is decide what acts a player is actually committing in their scene versus what acts that player thinks they are committing. Because acts can be, like, anytime a player does something in a scene, quote unquote, the term scene is honestly defined once and doesn't really come up again. It could be abandoned and just replaced with turn, except sometimes there could be multiple player characters in a scene, so that I think is a bit of a failure in description as well. But while the rules say you can have sort of a non-determined act, which is just other players decide what, a person has done in a scene that qualifies as an act that is not in the rules. Other acts are basically specific PBTA moves that players can choose to do, or other players can decide your character has done in a scene that has determined causes and effects. So it's just really kind of finicky in that way. And once again, it seems like a lot of the things other players would be doing in your scene is just acting as a GM, except they're not called the GM and anyone can do it. And that makes it not really collaborative storytelling for me, but just sort of group jamming, which I would consider a different kind of thing. Another problem with the sort of storytelling focus of the game is that it has a lot of mechanics. Like, each day is divided into sort of 6 acts, and a random player starts a scene by describing their location, sort of. It says you do that, but the example of play doesn't really support it. They start by describing what's going on around them, and they just decide what they're going to do in that day slot, or in that time slot. Let me scroll down. Like, the character creation is briefly described here, but there's not enough detail for any of it to really make sense until later portions occur. Okay, so now here we get to acts, rather phases, and each one has a minimum and maximum number of acts that they can have. And like I said, they sort of talk about scenes and how there can be as many or as little scenes as you want, I think they say at one point, but that would kind of be dependent on acts, and it really just looks more like players' turns. So I feel like that's not exactly well defined either. But basically, players just describe what their character does in a certain time frame of the day. There's a couple things Big Brother does in these time frames, and there's I guess suggestions of what to do, because I don't know if there are mechanics around work. I haven't read that far yet. But basically in the morning you would just be going about your day, then later you would be working, then later there's lunch, stuff like that. I actually do know that work does modify things, because certain acts you can commit are fine in other phases, but become thought crimes during work phases. And so getting on to the acts, which is what I was supposed to be doing, an act is no longer than 10 minutes, and that is in-game time, not real-life time. Even though an act is before described as something potentially even like killing someone, which in most cases I feel like takes longer than 10 minutes. Maybe not the very moment of the crime, depending on the weapon used, but in most cases, it's going to take more than 10 minutes to murder someone if you're not a professional, I feel like. And so here are some of the acts. Which, as you can see, have full explanations of what actually happens when you do them. But a lot of the times you're not choosing to do them, you're just describing what your character does. And then someone else decides that you are doing an act. And I don't know how that works with the descriptions of some of these, honestly. Especially with undefined acts. I don't know how an undefined act is supposed to work when it has no definition. That's another thing where sort of the freeform storytelling theme of the game really conflicts with how definitively planned out a lot of the ways it's supposed to work are. There's also an occasionally simulationist level of detail, like dealing with stuffs like injuries and healing and income and how to buy goods and stuff that would really be a lot more fitting in a character-focused, game where you're simulating things than a sort of more artsy, honestly, storytelling game where a lot of the focus is on themes of resistance rather than actual successful acts of resistance. Because it's really hard to configure, having to focus on all these individual things your character can do and the ways they can do them mechanically, and at the same time think about more storytelling and deciding what aspects of the environment you have any control of versus other players have control of. Each character has other trusted characters that are not the other player characters, that the other player characters can act as, and it's not necessarily one other player to a trusted character. Anyone, it seems like, can choose to play that character, which sounds like it would create poor consistency, and again is kind of one of the reasons why most games have a single GM, to create that level of consistency with things like NPCs. But Other than that, there's also strangers, and the Big Brother character plays any strangers, but it's not really clear how strangers would come into a scene except by a player actively bringing one in with an act, which is a thing they can do. So there's really a lot of. I haven't even gotten into a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of moving parts to the system, and a lot of mechanics, like managing stress and managing so many other aspects of your character, and the pros and cons of each act, and whether or not it constitutes a thought crime, and what situation, whether that's detected, that really make it seem like, a lot of things are supposed to be dictated by the rules and players strategizing, but there's also no way to really win or make progress in the game, and it's supposed to be based around sort of group storytelling, and I really don't know if these things can be reconciled very well. I think there are a lot of great ideas here, and it is unfortunately hard for me to tell without actually playing whether this sort of format works. It might actually be fine, despite all my complaints with it. Like, all the complaints I have with the system mechanically so far, at least partially, originate with the fact that it is. The rules are, I think, actively written poorly. And that is my main definitive complaint with the game, that I cannot really understand it, and so I can't tell if it's good or not. If I knew I was going to play it, I could definitely dedicate the time to sort of figuring it out. But this is, I'd say, on the level of difficulty of sort of figuring out how to GM for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which I know a lot of people like to pretend that system is easy to learn. It's really not. It's super complicated. There are so many details that can happen, and this, in theory, should be much simpler, but because of the way it's conveyed, everything's sort of in a different place from everything else, and it's never written as a series of steps that a player would perform that make it pretty much as difficult to understand. So I would need to know I was playing it to actually want to really figure out these rules. What I sort of mean by it's not written in a way that is ever a step-by-step process for a person playing is the one time I've encountered so far where the structure is sort of explained is the sort of overall explanation here in the example of play, which is a bit lower down. A lot of the terms are confusing here. Like, I think the scene definition doesn't really work. Okay, I'm gonna try and go back, see if I can find scene anywhere. Yeah, I probably couldn't find that, but I'm pretty sure that, there is really not defined a set number of scenes that can happen. It just depends on the number of acts that are performed. But there would have to be a certain number of scenes based on each player having to do at least one act and stuff like that. Yes, it really doesn't define when, like, the daily broadcast happens. You would have to understand what a hate session is, which is way later, I assume, to have any context for that. None of what acts are is really described here, so I think I had more problems with sort of the vagueness of the way this is described, especially in scenes, but the main problem that jumps out to me with this being here right now is you have almost none of the information to understand the context to understand what this segment really means at this point. Looking at the example of play, which is not much later, but a little bit later. So, you start with one character, right? That character describes their location, except they really don't, except that it's a bed and there's breadcrumbs. And the big brother, jumps in anytime they want to do the announcement and then doesn't repeat it in later scenes. And so Lisa just, moves on, keeps doing the stuff they want to, but never really establishes what they're doing as an act or not, and no one else jumps in to do that. And then they just move on, it looks like. Or maybe because unable to act, there is not an act for that scene, and you can do a scene without acts, but later in undefined acts, it says that scenes that don't have an act established, a established act that a player does, are themselves acts, so that's kind of ambiguous. And my main point is, we don't really see Lisa doing any act, which is a huge part of how the game is supposed to work. And once we move on from Lisa, we go to Vuzek. We move off of Lisa's point of view, in a manner of speaking, which is where it becomes not about what a character does, but rather what a player does. Like, step by step for a player would be saying, first what they do on their turn, and then what they do on everybody else's turn. Because every player is still in there, and they have the opportunity to act up, or rather to call for a test, or to establish something as an act. And as a player, I would look a step-by-step thing, like going through, okay, here's what you do on your turn, here's what the big brother can do to you while you're doing things on your turn, here's what you can do on someone else's turn. And instead of that, they've sort of gone through an overall what the game looks like from I'll call it a top-down perspective, even though that doesn't necessarily apply. Like a landscape from a big overhead view instead of focusing on one specific area. And that requires you to have an understanding of how the entire game works, rather than just what you would do or would not do as a player, which is a much simpler way to explain and learn things. Sort of like the game of life, if you're familiar with that. If you told someone about the game of life by just, and this is going to make no sense if you're not aware of what I'm talking about, by what the rules that dictate how a black space acts when there are white spaces next to it, you would have a very simple explanation. Whereas if you try to go over all the descriptions of all the things that can result from that, and sort of what the game of life looks like to a player after you have placed those spaces and the rules start interacting, you would have a much more complex explanation that has a lot of unnecessary information and stuff. This sort of goes all the way back to my complaints about the table of contents. It's really a clue to the fact that the game is not organized in a way that it is easy to learn at all. Like, none of this tells me what's going to be in the sections. Same as this, sort of. Like, you would think, oops, I didn't even know that was links. You would think that, that's a nice feature, but you would think that character creation describes a lot more of character creation than it actually does. This sounds like it's sort of advice and not literally saying, there's a big brother and then there's every other player. Like, I really wouldn't call that two types of player, because one of those types only has one player in it. And advice on describing locations, I've sort of already gone over this, but this table of contents just does not seem helpful to really understand what you're supposed to be doing. And the same goes for everything that, falls under these headings. They don't really explain things well, it's not step by step. It's not in a way that helps me learn or understand the game. there were like a couple more things I wanted to go over, but I can't quite remember them right now. Yeah, as someone designing a system, it's very tempting to describe what the game is like and sort of contextualize the rules so that a player really understands the value of those rules. But when you're doing that, it makes it very hard to understand what those rules actually are or how to learn them. And a lot of the time, it's better to not really describe the game, but just be like, okay, here, if you're a player, these are the things you do. And that's a better way to describe it a lot of the time. As just sort of a side note that I wanted to say, there's still some tonal inconsistencies as well to me. And maybe I've said this before, I can't quite remember, but yeah, they talk about things that are deviations, and this is sort of your motivation, and it is a severe thought crime, and it is ever found out, you'll be instantly executed. And it's the entire reason, like, behind there being a resistance member. And yet the deviation is stuff like, I love the sound of birds. Now, it's hard for me to imagine genuinely any dystopian environment that is so over the top, honestly, that would be worthy of execution. Like, that is honestly pretty crazy. And I want to say, like, I'm not saying that can't work in a setting that's all about people not having any emotions, say, but nothing here indicates that. You're even supposed to have emotions. Like, you're even supposed to relax and stuff like that. So I don't know why the sound of birds specifically being something you enjoy would be so heinous that it would be worthy of execution or cause a player to deviate and resist and stuff, or longing for love. People are supposed to procreate and have families, depending on their position and stuff. It's just, I feel like tonally things are still kind of inconsistent. And this really works more in a artsy or metaphorical dystopia than something that is supposed to be heavily planned out and realistic. But a lot of the mechanics and descriptions of how you're supposed to make decisions seem to focus on a kind of realism. Alright, I'm back. I had to stop for a minute to try to collect my thoughts again, but another thing here is the sort of, technically for some of the acts, there are actively resolution mechanics that are doing tests, and in that specific case, the test does affect success or failure, which is kind of just an interesting thing that is inconsistent. And ultimately, one of the reasons everything is so complicated is that there is no resolution mechanic, and the consequences for how things established rely on a third party, the big brother, who gets his own resource and may or may not detect things that occur and can step in different ways. And then there's the stress system. Like, basically what I'm just trying to say is, because instead of success or failure, it's a system of consequences, which the chances of build up over time based on various conditions and a third party, and that third party's roles and decision, that the game gets really complicated. I don't think it is unsalvageably complicated, but I definitely think there are places you could trim the fat, and I think there are places that you could, like, I think changing the way the rulebook is written would be very helpful. Like, for an example, I think the terminology of scenes is not very helpful. I think having the axe be either undefined or a specific move that you choose to do is not very good. Like, in theory, you could just make it a player describes what they do in a scene, then chooses consequences up to 3, say if it's the morning phase, of the actions that they have taken, and they have to pick at least one consequence of the things they've done, and that's just the effect they want to achieve by doing the things they've done. And then other players can jump in and say, well, you did this should have X effect, actually. And discussion can happen that way. I think focusing more on effects rather than actions is probably better, because then you don't have sort of disagreement between whether a player is choosing to execute moves or describing their day. I also think that either having a single player to decide, maybe per phase, to decide whether people make checks, rather tests, or just having every act require a test, which I think would work perfectly fine. So either delegating things more a la a GM, or having things be fully automated instead of having things rely on a mix of other players' decisions and complicated rules. I think, picking either automated rules or a GM, if the only value of the contributions of other players is to perform the job of a GM effectively, but without a clear person to decide the rules. I just don't really see the point of having it be collaborative storytelling style if that is never actually constructive. I think that's a change that could make things a bit better. Overall, I definitely think there's a lot of value to the system, and if I was running sort of an Orwellian dystopia game, I probably would pick it and really learn the rules and potentially make changes, to the way I ran it. But just as something to read, I can't really say it's worthwhile, and in terms of whether I can't tell you if you did pick up and try to use this game, I can't tell you how much you would have to change to make it work, because I really couldn't wrap my head around the rules in their current form without an in-depth study, which I don't think is justified for me at this point. But there's definitely some interesting stuff to look at here. Like, I did say that, I can't say it's worthwhile reading, but I wouldn't really say that. I mean, just check it out. And if it doesn't grab you immediately, sure, don't really bother reading, but I think skimming it, there are still some interesting ideas in there you could learn from. I just think the rulebook definitely needs more work. The game itself, like I said before, might actually be fine. I have a lot of things that I think could be cause for concern, or things that, if they were adjusted, I think would make the game better. But it's possible that if I was playing this at a table with other people, and someone already knew the game, it would function perfectly well. That's kind of the challenge of designing a tabletop RPG, that designing the game oftentimes is something of the easy part. Figuring out how to describe and arrange those rules in a way that works when you're not actively teaching someone next to you can be extremely complicated. And that's kind of it for my thoughts on Oceania 2084. I think the game's doing relatively well, and that it had a Kickstarter or some sort of crowdfunding that succeeded, and obviously there's been a lot of playtesting, so I think things are going well for it, and hopefully that continues.